Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our next session here at the Connection Conference. The data integration strategy your student recruitment is missing, featuring Mike Keene from Carnegie. Before we get started, I did want to address just a few housekeeping items. First and foremost, the session will be recorded. We'll be providing that to all attendees by the end of next week, so know that will be coming. All session attendees are on mute and off camera, so just as an FYI there. And while you definitely can experience both the Zoom and the Whova functionality for this session, we do encourage and ask that you ask any questions within the Zoom Q&A area specifically. That'll give us the best chance of making sure that we see it and are able to cover it towards the end of the session. We will actually dedicate some time at the end to get to as many questions as possible, so we definitely encourage you to go ahead and participate and ask anything that you like. Also, if you have any questions about just the conference overall or need anything technically, you can email us at conferences@carnegiehighered.com or message us in Whova through the Ask Organizers Anything section on the community board. And then finally, we do encourage you to be social as you're attending any and all of the sessions that we are hosting throughout the week. You can use hashtag the connection as well as tag at Carnegie at Carnegie HQ for any posts that you're doing. So with that, I'm excited to introduce Mike Keene for our next section here. Thanks, Mike.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Mark, you can hear me well?
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect. So I appreciate everyone joining today and welcome to the data integration strategy your student recruitment is missing. Alternative title, how to insist on using data as a plural noun to give the appearance of sophistication. By way of introduction, my name is Mike Keene. I'm the Senior Vice President of Modeling here at Carnegie. I lead our quantitative modeling team. Our mission is to work with Carnegie's client institutions to develop an understanding of key student outcomes like application, yield, and retention, and then wrap those quantitative models desiring to understand those outcomes in consulting services so that our client institutions can focus interventions and can focus especially limited resources to improve those outcomes. My Carnegie archetype is the resilient and influential energizer. My own professional background is I actually got started in this work expecting to become a faculty member in political science before I took a detour into enrollment management that took me into leadership roles on the institutional side and first enrollment analytics and then financial aid before I came to the consulting side, first at McGuire Associates and then following Carnegie's acquisition of McGuire Associates, now leading the modeling team at Carnegie. Despite having a PhD in political science, I know very little, in fact, almost nothing about actual politics. And most of my research was on voter behavior and was closer to social psychology than anything particularly political. But I live in Los Angeles, where I was born and raised and where I spent most of my life. And so I'm happy to be talking about data integration strategy today. But if we also want to just talk about the Dodgers, that's fine too. I want to make sure that I frame our discussion today in a few ways. First is by reviewing the challenges that higher ed is facing today that motivate the need for better data integration. I want to define and describe some key elements of data integration, and then give a couple of specific examples that are each selected for specific reasons of ways that data integration can inform better decision making. I don't think that this quote that I've selected to start our discussion of the challenges facing higher education will surprise you. As you're reading through it while I'm talking, these are problems that are familiar to all of us. This quote speaks specifically to drops in application and enrollment volume. It speaks to the possibility or the reality of closures and institutional mergers. It talks about drops in faculty and student morale. Importantly, it links those problems to demographic changes. It links them to specifically the drop in the number of high school graduates, but also not just a volume challenge, but also a perception challenge, because there is this growing perception that college is too expensive, that it might not pay off in terms of expanded or more lucrative career opportunities. Effectively, none of these observations are new based on what we've been hearing, saying, seeing for the last especially 10 years. Except that this quote isn't from the past 10 years, the past 20 years, even 40 years. It's almost 50 years old. It comes from an article in the Boston College Alumni magazine written by Jack McGuire in 1976, prior to him founding McGuire Associates. And at the time, he was talking about anticipated enrollment declines that were expected to occur in the 1980s. That article in Bridge magazine in 1976 is notable for a couple of reasons. One is, and what it's known for most, is that it was the first time that the phrase enrollment management appeared in print. And it was as part of this article that Jack described enrollment management as an integrated system of offices that results in more effective enrollment operations. And in many ways, this was one of the seminal data integration moments for enrollment and higher ed, but it also, alongside that, articulated the series of looming challenges that are frankly virtually identical to those that we're talking about today. Mark Twain was reputed to have said that history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Truthfully, there's actually no evidence that Mark Twain ever said this or wrote this. It first appeared in print in this format in 1965. And one of the things that you'll note about my presentation today is that one of my favorite things is totally apocryphal quotes. In other words, things that are very profound, things that are attributed to authors with little to no evidence that they actually said them. But in this case, I'm quoting probably not Mark Twain, to remind ourselves that the challenges that higher ed is facing today are not necessarily new, and our tools or our toolkit might appear to be new, but the challenges are old. So why do we need more effective data integration? I think higher ed has a couple of problems, none of which are going to be new to those of you on this call. And we have a new student problem, we have a student success problem, we have a net revenue problem, and we have a resource problem. And all of those are intertwined in complex and challenging ways. First would be this idea of a new student problem. You can be forgiven for looking at this figure, which shows applications for admission from new first-time in college students over the period from 2014 to 2022, and this is coming from IPED's data, and thinking, not bad, right? That over this period, the number of applications from first-time students grew from about 9.6 million in 2014 to more than 13 million in 2022, and that's 35% growth. There are a lot of industries that would be thrilled with 35% growth in potential customers over that period, except that it's not growth in actual students. It's mostly just growth in the number of applications being submitted by a dwindling number of students. So in 2014, about 3.1 million degree-seeking students enrolled in college for the first time. And the key for both of these is that they're both first-time in college students. So have there been other changes? Have there been different trends in other students? Yes, in this case, we're talking specifically about first-time in college students. So in 2014, about 3.1 million degree-seeking students enrolled in college for the first time. And then by 2022, that was about 2.9 million. So we have a 35% increase in first-time applications, a 7% decline in first-time enrollments. I mean, I would suggest that this specific challenge, that we have more applications but fewer enrollees, is particularly problematic because it means that each application means a little bit less, that each application is less likely to have some level of existing affinity with your institution. Each application is less likely to result in an enrollment, but each application still has to be processed. Each application has to be given thorough and holistic consideration. Each applicant has to be recruited, they have to be counseled, they have to be communicated with. So institutions are facing higher volume in many cases, and frankly, often with smaller teams, but less certainty and more noise. Second, higher ed has a student success problem. Of course, we're all familiar, or I presume that many of us are very familiar with first-year retention rates as a signal of how institutions are serving students. In this case, the traditional first-year retention rate is the proportion of students who enroll at a college in the fall as a first-time in college student who return to that same institution in the subsequent fall. And we know that those rates are often not great. For the fall 22 entering first-time in college cohort, about 68% returned to the same institution in the subsequent fall. The National Student Clearinghouse reports these data a little bit differently in a way that I think is meaningful and important, because it also captures the students who do return to an institution of higher education, just a different institution of higher education in the subsequent fall. I mean, that's great because it's a far more flexible way to accommodate differences in student behavior. Even in that definition, almost a quarter of first-time in college students who enrolled in fall of 22 were enrolled at any institution covered by the clearinghouse in fall 23. And if you think about the amount of time and the energy and the resources that went into identifying and recruiting and admitting and enrolling those students, and then if you think doubly so about the time and energy and emotion and money, frankly, that those students and their families devoted to that process, it's a stunning stat when you consider that almost a quarter of them will not be enrolled at any institution in the subsequent fall. Now, it is important to note that this isn't necessarily getting worse. The trend is basically flat over the course of the past 10 cohorts, but it's also not getting better. The same thing is basically true for completion rates. In this case, we're using a relatively traditional 6-year completion rate for first-time in college students. And we're talking about the proportion of students who entered college as first-time in college students in cohorts from 2006 to 2017, who had completed their course of study within 6 years. Now, there's a fair bit of variation here, as you might imagine, by institutional type. But even if we limit it just to 4-year public and 4-year private not-for-profit institutions, almost 30% of students are not completing their program of study within 6 years. Higher ed also has a net revenue problem. These two charts are two of my favorite higher ed trend charts. They come from the College Board's Trends in College Pricing and Student Aid series. And the newest version of these were released just last week. They show inflation adjusted both published costs and net revenue or net costs at but in this case, public and private 4-year not-for-profit institutions. It is worth noting here that these are in 2024 dollars, so they're inflation adjusted. Now, because we've been in a pretty significant inflationary period over the course of the past few years, most of these published costs in 2024 dollars have actually declined over the last 3 to 5 years. But the key is, and I think especially if you focus on the lines in the bottom half of these charts, is that published tuition and fees have been steadily increasing until the last few years in 2024 dollars. And I don't think that would be a surprise to anyone. Obviously, whether it's the total published cost, whether it's the direct cost, tuition, fees, housing, and food, or whether it's just the published tuition and fee cost, we've been aware that for the past 15 or 20 years, increases to the published costs of college, whether public or private, have been rapidly, in some cases, outpacing inflation and have led to the perception of a cost crisis in higher ed. The key is, though, that while those published, especially if you focus just on tuition and fees, published costs have been steadily increasing, that grant aid, which in this case encompasses all forms of institutional discounting, has been increasing faster. And that means that institutions, especially inflation adjusted, are collecting less net tuition and fee revenue per student than they were 5 or 10 years ago. And when you compare that less net tuition and fee revenue per student with the decline in overall enrollments, that's a particular challenge. And I do want to footnote here that yes, this is inflation adjusted, which does make that the trend a little bit more stark. I would argue that inflationary pressure is really significant for colleges and universities. Institutions of higher education tend to have very large fixed costs that are also highly susceptible to inflationary pressure, things like salary and benefit costs, things like financing for capital projects and building projects, even things like food service contracts. And so I think in this case, the inflation adjusted figure is an appropriate way to consider this. I want to, as we make this transition, return for a second to Jack's article from 1976. Now, keep in mind, this is from 1976. And note that one of his most critical recommendations was this expanded use of reliable computerized information systems, effectively CRMs, student information systems, which were at that point in their very nascent stages, were just being developed. But not just reliable systems, but what he describes is systems that coordinate data retrieval with analysis and timely decision-making. In other words, 48 years ago, we were talking about data integration, and today we're talking about data integration. So if we accept that higher ed is facing some of these key challenges, a new student problem, a student success problem, a revenue problem, and a resource problem, because we're being asked to do more at institutions with limited and in some cases less resources than we had 5 or 10 years ago, why do we think that better use of data might be a way to address those challenges? And what do we mean by effective data integration? First, data integration is difficult because the landscape is really complex. This is the EduVentures Research Higher Ed Technology Landscape infographic, the most recently available one from last year. And this, I think, emphasizes that the challenge here is that data integration is difficult because data is stored across many different systems. It's stored with varying levels of quality assurance. There's different levels of aggregation, and there's often multiple unique and non-unique, even student ID numbers, one of the sort of core elements of data integration. Additionally, data and the systems that the data are stored in are overseen by administrators and administrative leadership, and they have incentives to avoid sharing data. And some of those incentives are good. There's key issues related to student privacy. There's limits on permissible use, but some of those incentives are bad. There's also, frankly, at institutions, territorialism. There's campus politics. I don't think that those are new or unique to those of you that are on the call that are at an institution of higher education. And then additionally, institutions are limited often in their available internal resources to do this core work, to identify, to catalog, to combine, and to analyze this data. Now, I'll footnote here that I think that many institutions of higher education have more of these resources than they've had at any point in the last 15, 20, 25 years. And whether that's in an institutional research office, whether it's in an enrollment analytics office, whether it's in faculty who are working in and adjacent to this work, whether it's in a decision support office, that institutions have recognized how critical it is to organize, make sense of, interpret, and then apply the data that they're collecting about students, especially over the course of the last 15 or 20 years. We are in a better position today than at any point in terms of having these resources to bring to bear on these challenges. The problem is that this explosion in the complexity and the decentralization and the siloed nature of this work at institutions has been at least keeping pace with the investment in resources to manage it. So where do we start with data integration? Back to the apocryphal quotes. The first one is you'll often see with the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. This is typically credited as an ancient Chinese proverb. This is another one that it only begins to appear anywhere in the middle of the 20th century. The second one, and if we go back to the baseball analogies, I can confidently attribute, because it is my personal experience, that as you walk into stadiums of any type, but especially baseball stadiums in the 80s and 90s, this can't tell the players without a program, right? And this is particularly poignant for me, partly because this is a moment for me watching the World Series and the Dodgers, and partly because, like many people, my introduction to statistics and my nostalgia about statistics started with baseball. And I mention this because data integration starts meaningfully with a data inventory. The example here that's on the right is from Chapman University. I promise you this isn't sponsored. They have no idea I'm using this. My team doesn't work with Chapman University to do this work. It was just among the best examples that I identified online of ways that I've seen this done at institutions. So a data inventory identifies not just the data sources that are available, which is pretty straightforward, but also all of the tools that are available for extracting and analyzing that data. And that includes those traditional and new sources, but also both internal and external sources. And some of these are easy ones, right? They're your admission CRM, they're your student information system, they're a learning management system. But some of them are also going to be external or what appear to be more limited sources around attitudinal surveys or around external sources like National Student Clearinghouse data. The data inventory is the who, what, the when, the where, and the why, and how of data integration. And it's a critical first step to building that new approach to data integration. And the key here is that if you start to get bogged down with the data inventory, that using the phrase data governance a lot will typically open doors, because just like using data as a plural noun, it gives the appearance of sophistication. Second, and supplementary to the data inventory piece, is I want to make two observations about the reasons that data integration efforts often fail. The reasons why, despite their best efforts, institutional stakeholders are unable to extract, combine, analyze, and then apply data from multiple places on campus or multiple systems or multiple types of data. The first is that sometimes they fail because institutional stakeholders throw up their hands that the data that they're collecting or identifying aren't exactly what they need, or they're not in the exact format, or they're not for the exact time period. And the key here is that data quality is not a binary. It's not good or bad. We work with client institutions that have significant internal resources to do this work. And even then, their data aren't magically pristine. They're better, but they're not perfect. And there's often this impression that using imperfect data, that using data that's not 100% clean and comprehensive and consistent will lead to flawed decisions. But the irony here is that our own experience in working with lots of different institutions to do this work is that the hairiest data spiders tend to lurk under the cleanest and best organized rocks, if that makes sense. If you wait for perfect data, you'll never have a chance to show what data integration can do. And that's certainly what Lauren Conrad of Laguna Beach and the Hills and numerous fashion and fragrance ventures would want us to remember. That's another one that's not apocryphal. It actually appeared in Vogue, and I read the article that appears in. Second, the need to combine data from different sources or systems is typically an impediment to data integration. I will note here that data integration doesn't require data merging across systems. Sometimes data integration is about bringing together different types of data from the same system, and that's our first example that we'll raise coming up. But when you do need to combine data from different systems and different sources, I'm willing to guess that if you're attending today from an institution, you've encountered challenges related to data warehousing. Just as we talked about with data integration being held back by this desire for perfect data, it's also often held back in institutions because there's a belief that data integration must happen in elaborate, expensive data warehouse solutions. In the worst case, the data warehouse becomes the end goal rather than a means to that end. And where the truth is that just as often as when there's a beautiful or pristine or elaborate or expensive data warehouse, effective data integration occurs when a motivated person identifies and extracts data from different sources, different systems, combines that data and looks at problems in a new way. I do want to make clear here that the concept of a data warehouse is great. I don't have any objection to data warehouses. Executed well, data warehouses make this work easier. They make it more efficient. I have also had personal and professional experience of watching a lot of data warehouse projects fail or inhibit data integration, which is exactly the opposite of what they're intended to do. And I don't want to give you the impression today that a data warehouse or any sort of elaborate system of collecting and combining data is somehow a prerequisite for effective data integration. I want to next move to 3 specific and concrete examples of data integration, and these are selected for 3 specific reasons. The first one is work that we've done here at Carnegie in developing a new lead scoring and yield modeling product we call Engage. That one's selected because it uses data from a single system, the admission CRM, and in this case, specifically Slate, as an example of integrating different types of data from the same system. So we'll start with that. The second is an example of integrating both internal and external data, and it's data that I think are sort of criminally underutilized, which is the National Student Clearinghouse student tracker data. And that's a way to use that data, combining internal and external data to build more effective transfer recruitment efforts. And then the third is an example of integrating data from 2 different sources at the institution that often do not speak to each other. And that's about using institutional survey data collected through things like the BESI and the NESI surveys to more effectively measure and understand some really critical social emotional concepts that are a critical part of understanding first-year retention that are typically measured only by proxy. So first, the Engage example. So in the example of Engage, the system is the single system. It's the admission CRM. And the admission CRM here and for Engage as a product, we're talking specifically about Slate, is used as a standalone specifically because it allows us to do some things around automation and data extraction and putting these data pieces back into client Slate instances. But as an example of data integration, one of the most critical pieces of data-driven decision-making that happens at institutions are lead scoring, which is assessing the probability that a prospective student, whether they're a prospect or an inquiry, will apply to your institution. And then separately, yield scoring, assessing the probability that an admitted student will enroll. And lead scoring and yield scoring underlie an enormous amount of evidence-based decision-making that help inform resource allocation, how you'll spend money on search, what sources you'll prioritize, how you'll assess your efforts to intervene and improve application probability. And then especially at the yield scoring level, it'll inform things like designing effective scholarship and grant programs, focusing resources on recruiting populations that are a critical part of the institutional mission, and assessing general recruitment strategy and resource allocation around things like communication and events and scholarship interventions. Typically, lead scoring and yield scoring models use these traditional student level variables. They have academic variables, they have geodemographic variables, they have financial indicators, alongside what has often been relatively blunt behavioral metrics like, did the student visit campus? Did the student attend an information session? In this case, Engage is designed to integrate data differently because it combines those traditional predictors with more granular measures of student behavior, things like email engagement, like virtual and in-person events, time on the institution's web properties. And as I mentioned, by relying on data solely from Slate, we're able to automate the scoring and regularly refresh a custom-built portal that's developed in each institution's Slate instance with counselor-level action lists so that the institution can take advantage of this just-in-time understanding of which students are becoming, where their engagement behavior with the institution is becoming more intense, and there might be an opportunity for a really well-timed, really well-focused outreach. I raise this as an example, both because it is something that is extraordinarily familiar to me and my team, because we spent a lot of time on it over the course of the last years, but also because it is an example of data integration that doesn't require merging data from different systems. And it is an example of data integration that if you work at an institution and if you are a Slate captain or if you have access to data from a system like Slate, you can start exploring on your own. Data integration can mean tapping into underutilized sources of data already available in a system of record. It can involve extracting that alongside with those more traditional indicators and using that for more effective decision making. So integration here does not mean that we're collecting data from the student information system, that there's an elaborate data pipeline that merges and deduplicates that against the CRM system, and that we use that for decision making. We do that work. We do that work when we do financial aid optimization. But in this case, we are focused specifically on using data just from Slate and making sure that we are tapping into this underutilized, more granular information about which students are engaged with the institution and how they are engaged with the institution and what the sort of intensity over time is of that engagement. The second data integration example I want to use is one that I feel strongly about, and we've seen grow in recent years as institutions have embraced this opportunity, but I think is still underutilized. And here we're talking about using data from your admission CRM, probably from your student information system, but particularly from the National Student Clearinghouse. Your institution probably uses the National Student Clearinghouse for enrollment reporting to the NSLDS for federal aid and enrollment reporting compliance. But what that means is that it's also likely that your institution has access to relatively comprehensive information on which of your prospective first-year students who applied to your institution and actually may have been admitted to your institution, but then subsequently chose not to enroll, which of those students chose to enroll at a two-year institution. So if you collect that data and you upload your institutional data to the clearinghouse, you get the data report back. You can combine your own admission CRM and SIS data with National Student Clearinghouse data to identify students who might be a great fit for a potential future transfer to your institution, because you know that they were originally an applicant, maybe even originally an admitted student, possibly even originally a student put down a commitment deposit, but chose not to enroll at your institution. And that's a student who you can guarantee had at least some level of interest and affinity in your institution. Separately, you can drill into that data based on certain academic programs where you think that there might be a stronger opportunity for transfer enrollment, programs where your institution is growing the number and proportion of transfer students, programs that have academic components or co-curricular components that are a better fit for transfer enrollment. So rather than trying to spread that transfer outreach thin across thousands or tens of thousands of students who might have relatively little affinity with your institution, you can speak directly to students who have already indicated interest in your institution. While the student separately is at the two-year institution, you also have an opportunity to build that affinity and to focus those outreach, those advising interventions to ensure that smoother transfer experience. Alongside, frankly, many of the institutions that we work with on this consider aid interventions, dedicated aid programs, especially if there's an indication or an expectation that a reason why the student didn't enroll at the institution in the first place, at the four-year institution, is because of a potential challenge around net cost and willingness and ability to pay. Separately, in this case, students benefit because students benefit from that personalized and that really relevant outreach that helps them identify institutions that might be a great fit for transfer. The other footnote here is that I've focused this on 2-year institutions. Obviously, the National Student Clearinghouse will also tell you what 4-year institutions your applicants and admitted non-enrolling students are enrolled at. In the wake of the NACAC consent decree a few years ago, there is technically nothing that prevents your institution from recruiting students at other 4-year institutions, but that is getting into a little bit of a soupier area on recruitment and enrollment. So when we focus this work, we focus this on how can we build better, more systematic, more relevant transfer pipelines for institutions by tapping into data that is already available and likely relatively easily accessible. The third example is something that was frankly more popular, I would say 10 to 15 years ago, that you don't see as much about anymore, but it's something that I think is even more critical as institutions wrestle and in some cases invest resources to try to build a better understanding of retention. And that's that institutions are working on either with a vendor or internally on these retention and student success models that focus intervention. So the intervention might be outreach, it might be advising, it might be an emergency grant to try to reduce attrition. And those models are a lot like the lead scoring or yield scoring models. They combine academic data, geodemographic data, financial data, and behavioral data, and try to get an understanding of what are the factors that are associated with the student's probability to return to the institution, to persist, to succeed at the institution. The shortcoming of these models is that they typically rely on these student level factors that are really proxies. They're proxies for concepts like affinity and sense of belonging. And it's not that whether and to what extent a student joins student organizations isn't related to retention, but the reality is that what you're measuring is the student's sense of belonging, the student's sort of intrinsic motivation to become more involved on campus. The student gets access to more resources on campus. And we've often built retention models that will look at whether and to what extent a student earns at least some of their work study award. And that's not because we think that the relatively nominal amounts that are associated with work study positions are making a profound difference in affordability, as much as it is that we know that that's a signal that the student feels at home enough to seek out on-campus employment. And it means that they are regularly, in some cases multiple times a week, checking in with an on-campus supervisor. All of these are proxy measures for really important intrinsic concepts like sense of belonging and affinity. Well, many institutions, and possibly your institutions, are using surveys like the Beginning College Survey of Student Engagement and the National Survey of Student Engagement, or separate surveys that are just at your institution, or admitted student research surveys. There is more surveying going on at your institution than you're likely aware of. And those are sometimes directly measuring some of these critical attitudinal concepts, some of these critical social emotional concepts about, does the student feel empowered? Does the student feel that they belong at the institution? Is the student making meaningful connections with their peers, with faculty members, with administrative offices? And that means that rather than measure those around the corner by using really blunt proxies like engagement with student clubs and organizations, you might be able to identify students that are raising their hand and saying, I'm struggling. And that's a more powerful way to identify and focus interventions. And that intervention might not be dollars, it might not be an emergency grant, but it can be outreach, it can be advising. There are a variety of resources that are available at institutions that they understand are important to contributing to better retention outcomes, that institutions struggle to focus on the students who need them most. And so combining the survey data with more traditional student level indicators around academic and geodemographic and financial and behavioral concepts are a way to integrate data, identify students who are most at risk of attrition, and focus interventions where they can make the biggest difference. There's a couple of things that these examples have in common that motivated why I chose them today. First is that none of these require an elaborate and expensive data warehouse solution. I say in parentheses yet there because obviously there are plenty of examples of data warehouse solutions that have been implemented at institutions that have made this work significantly easier and more efficient. That when they're well done, data warehouses are a good thing. They do combine information from different institutions, they standardize, they deduplicate them, and they make them available for analytical staff and decision makers at the institution to use these data in effective and timely ways. But as I mentioned, that doesn't mean that you need that data warehouse to do this work, and that a motivated person with access to this underlying data and some time and analytical capacity can combine this data and look at it in new ways, try to bring it to bear on existing problems with a new lens. The second is they don't require a vendor relationship. Now, obviously, I work for a quantitative modeling team at a higher ed consulting vendor. So if you would like to work with us, I promise we'll make that opportunity available to you. But I've also worked on the institutional side doing this work myself, and in some cases, being tasked to do this work to assess whether it was worth doing it internally or worth engaging a vendor. And so the important piece is that you don't need a vendor to do this work if you have the analytical capacity at the institution. And I think if I want to skip forward to that fourth piece, in many cases, these data integration examples don't require data skill sets that are not already present at the institution. It might mean bringing together a couple of different persons that are working in different offices. It might mean that you've got one person with the expertise in the underlying data and another person with expertise in the data analysis. But these are data skill sets that increasingly are available in decision support in institutional research offices, in enrollment analytics offices, in IT offices, in faculty offices, in a variety of different constituencies on campus. And that these are folks that are probably siloed in their work that might be interested in bringing together data, internal, external, from different sources at the institution, or different types of data in existing systems to be able to ask and answer more interesting questions. And then that third piece, these don't require developing, creating entirely new sources of data. We're not saying that data integration requires months or years of elaborate data engineering pipelines. Again, in an ideal state, this involves a data warehouse. It involves multiple years of building out these elaborate data engineering pipelines, but that's not what's required to get started. It's not what's required to collect pieces of information, to do that data inventory, to assess what sources of data are available, what toolkits are available, and how you might be able to combine that data, identify, and bring to bear a solution on an interesting data challenge. As we come to the end here, I want to return to Jack McGuire's article because when I showed it initially, I didn't mention what the article was titled. The title was "To the Organized Go the Students." And so I think as we face these enrollment challenges over the next 5 to 10 years, similar to those that Jack mentions in his article, I think that the institutions that are resilient to those challenges, the institutions that are able to confront and resolve those challenges, are those that will think about and use data in new and different ways. And while it's great if that happens with pristine data and it happens with a sophisticated data warehouse, it doesn't need to. And it can also, and often does happen, when you think carefully about what data sources are available and how you might be able to combine those to bring new insights to existing challenges. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Mark for a few housekeeping items, and then hopefully we'll get a chance to get into some questions and discussion. Mark?
Thank you so much, Mike. So much there and so valuable. So really, really appreciate it. I would encourage, I've got a couple questions that have come through so far, and would encourage anyone, if they do have additional questions, to share them in the Q&A feature. I think I just saw something in the chat that was specific to baseball loyalties. So, so we can have that discussion as well. But back to a little bit of some of the information that you had shared at the beginning, some of the trends and statistics. A couple questions came in reflective of that, which is this reflects data for all institutions of higher ed, correct? Including for-profits, which are notorious for horrific first-year attribution. Does that, can you just speak to that question?
Sure. So it varies. In some cases, where available, I try to focus it on four-year public and private not-for-profit institutions. The truth is that the comment is exactly correct, that if you lump in proprietary institutions there, you do get, in some cases, skewed data where student success rates will appear lower than they are at the public and private not-for-profit institutions that still educate the vast majority of students in the US. I think that even though when we focus on those traditional public and private not-for-profit institutions, and we're still confront some of those challenges around those student success rates, those completion rates. So not disagreeing with the note on proprietary institutions, and they're often significantly lower enrollment and success rates compared to not-for-profit institutions. And so we have tried to accommodate that in some places, and frankly, there are still some significant challenges, even at institutions that are not proprietary, in the number and proportion of students that are succeeding.
And same thing in terms of online or distance education students?
So that's a good question. That is, online and distance education, when you isolate to first time in college students, tend to be a smaller proportion of students. So online and distance education often, not always, involves students that are returning to higher education or involve students who have some prior college experience. So it's not as clear. And if we lump in those students, you do sometimes get a slightly more skewed proportion. So a lot of this is focused on relatively traditional, principally on-ground modality at public and four-year not-for-profit institutions. The depending on the institution and depending on the student population, those patterns can be a lot noisier at online and distance education programs. So I think the problems are the same, and in some cases, the challenges, enrollment challenges that would have appeared earlier over the course of the last 15 or 20 years have been allayed at these institutions because they've been successful at offering online and distance education. But I think those same programs are subject to some of the same challenges over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. But in other words, this is an affordability and a price sensitivity and a volume challenge for higher ed as a whole, not just specific to on-ground modalities and traditional institutions.
Great, thank you. I don't believe I have seen any other questions come through, and we're getting close to the time at the top of the hour. So I just do want to say thank you again so much, Mike, for everything that you covered today. Thank you to our attendees. You'll see here on the screen, we do have a QR code. There is obviously a significant conversation and value in data integration, as Mike covered so much today. So if you'd like to follow this QR code, you can certainly fill out the information and tap into the brilliant mind of Mike Keene, but he had referenced in one of his examples Carnegie's Engage score, and we actually recently launched our Engage Enroll score, and so anyone that fills out the QR code will be eligible for 25% off of that service, which we recently launched. So we invite you to check that out. Engage scores are a feature of Carnegie's Student Search. They empower you to recruit with confidence by giving you real-time insights that drive decision-making, and knowing your applicant's likelihood to apply and enroll allows you to focus time and resources on students with the highest propensity to take action. So I encourage you to follow that and check that out. In terms of the rest of the conference, we have one more session remaining today, and then a full slate of sessions Wednesday and Thursday. So really excited for all that is to come. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email us at conferences@carnegiehighered.com or the Ask Organizers Anything section within the community board in Whova. And up next at 4 o'clock Eastern time is our session SEO in the AI era, how to optimize your website for generative search engines. So we're excited for that session and hope you'll all join us there. And thanks again, Mike. Thanks again for all of our attendees, and hope you all have a great rest of the day.